Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this talk. I hope everybody's had a chance to get rehydrated and recaffeinated after that exciting presentation this morning. I've stopped crying, and although I did bring my Kleenex up, just in case. It was a really moving and overwhelming experience for me to hear the presentation this morning and to see the presentation, the video presentation that Tableau put together. Was really extraordinary. I think probably what you do is analogous to what I do. So much of reporting and book research is very solitary, and I collaborate with my editor. I had interviews with a lot of the women, so I'm talking to people periodically, but a lot of it is very solitary work in archives, and then a couple years really at home in your flannel pajamas, trying to deal with an overwhelming mass of data and information. In my case, interviews I conducted with women, oral histories that I'd found in other archives, records I'd gotten declassified, original training manuals that the Code Girls had actually trained on, just a vast and completely disorganized, when I found it, assortment of information. And so it was an overwhelming task for me every day. And I took a lot of inspiration actually from their story. And I think there's so many parallels between the work these women were doing and what you and I do today. And the sort of mantra, it's always overwhelming. Like, to feel overwhelmed is the norm, and to tell yourself that you can get through it, that you can persist, is just an important part of dealing with the overwhelm. And then, to come out of sort of 2 years of solitary work and to have the book go into the world, and to realize that you don't know if the story's gonna really resonate with anybody, and to find that it resonates with so many people and so many groups, and to see their story at a data analytics conference was something that I had not anticipated, and I'm sure that all of you have analogous experiences, right? I mean, at least some of your work, and maybe a lot of your work, is solitary, because you can work anywhere these days. And if you're a book author, you think of it going out to readers. You all think of it as going out to customers, I guess. But still, your work that you're doing either by yourself or in collaboration is going out into the world, and the world is reacting. The world is letting you know what they think about it, for better or worse, and then you're having to adjust to that. So I think that all of what we do is very analogous, and I think that there are a lot of lessons for all of us in a story that might seem like, World War II probably feels like it was a long time ago to a lot of you, but it really was very recent. So much of our STEM work was pioneered during World War II. That's when early computers were being developed to calculate weapons trajectories, to do ballistics calculations. Henderson, Nevada, just adjacent to Las Vegas, was a big a magnesium source during the war. So the remnants of World War II, and of course the freedoms that we enjoy, are all stemming from that time period. And the STEM work that was often pioneered by women, like these Code Girls or like Grace Hopper, is what we have inherited from that time period as well. So the historical period is still very important and relevant, and I think the lessons of that time, as Adam laid out so amazingly clearly, are still just so relevant and appropriate to us today. And so you'll see some of the same visuals, because a lot of the visuals that were used in that presentation were actually photographs and worksheets that I found in the National Archives at College Park, just swimming around in the files. I had to get some of them declassified. And so some of the images that you saw this morning, you'll see again today, but I can talk about them a little more at length. So again, just to show how relevant all of this is to all of our work every day, I'm curious to know how many of you at some point in your life have created a secret language, a secret way of communicating with somebody else when you were a kid or now? Right. So, so welcome to this very human impulse that we all have, not only to communicate, but sometimes, often, to communicate secretly in a language that people who are very important to us can understand, like our friends or our siblings. I asked this question of sixth graders, and every hand shot into the air. And I asked them, well, what kind of languages were you developing? And it was incredible. Sophisticated versions of sign language, signing to each other, very sophisticated versions of Pig Latin, of course, online codes. Now, one of them said, well, I put a Greek template over my laptop, and I, write in Greek, and then, my friend uses Google Translate to translate it out of the original Greek, and these are like 5th and 6th graders, and they're this human impulse, like even kids at the dinner table, right, or signing. Or a friend of mine, her parents would communicate in Yiddish to each other because the daughters couldn't understand it. So just this urge to communicate with people who are important, but to use a language that other people, and often if you're a kid, it's your parents, right? They're the enemy, or your teachers. When you're a kid, you're trying to keep the enemy from listening in. And of course, that's what we're doing now with cybersecurity. This is the impulse, and almost everything that we do on the internet now, our texts, and we want a lot of that stuff to be encrypted, right? I mean, there are a lot of encrypted apps now that we're using. It's all the same thing. It's the urge to communicate, often urgently, with important people, but not have other people listen in. And so we are doing the same work. In some ways, we started doing it as kids. We're still doing it now. And certainly during wartime, it's an absolutely crucial cat and mouse game between opposing sides to listen in on each other's communications in order to understand what's about to transpire. So I like to begin my presentation with a photo that illustrates what I think of as the plight of the educated woman in 1942. So these women were part of a very select portion of the population. In 1942, think in your heads about what percentage of women do you think got a college education in 1942? And it's not that high now. It's about 45% now. But back in 1942, 4% of American women got a 4-year college degree. These young women were about to graduate. They were in the senior class at Goucher College, which was a women's college in Baltimore, Maryland. It was called a girls' school at the time. The women who went there were called Goucher girls. And they were women, incredibly intelligent, determined women who had battled their way into an environment that would give them a very good education. One of the reasons that only 4% of women got degrees is because so much academic real estate was closed to women in 1942. The Ivy League, with the exception of Cornell, did not admit women. They had, sister schools sometimes, but Harvard, Princeton, Dartmouth, Yale didn't give 4-year degrees to women. In my home state of Virginia, University of Virginia held out until the late 1960s, giving full degrees to women, or even, at this point, admitting women. And so women were just barred from a lot of our great universities, and there were women's colleges that were created to educate them, but they were also tilting against a belief that either that women didn't need an education or that education wasn't good for women. So in the late 19th century, when a lot of women's colleges were developed, there was a Harvard physician that actually argued that higher education made women infertile because it swelled their brains at the expense of their wombs. And of course, people believed him because he was a Harvard physician, but not everybody believed him, but there was a widespread belief that women became sort of unpleasant to be around if they were overeducated and, sort of uppity or blue-stocking, or there were words for kind of hyper-educated women. So there was a general sense that maybe it wasn't that good for a woman to get too educated, or that it would not be useful, or there wouldn't be an economic payoff to a woman's education, because in 1942, if a woman did persevere and get a college degree, the fields of endeavor that she could go into that were considered respectable was really much limited to one, which was school teaching. And that's great if you want to be a school teacher. But if you want to be an architect or a lawyer or a doctor or a scientist or a businesswoman, you were going to be shut out of the graduate schools that you needed in order to get your degree and shut out of the professional networks. And so many families would do an economic calculation and say, coming out of the Depression, we don't have much money anyway. It's not worthwhile to pay her tuition because there's not going to be a payoff for it. So again, that just gives you a sense of how much perseverance and motivation these young women had to go to college. And Goucher was a very well-known, well-regarded liberal arts college. They had a rigorous education in Greek, Latin, physics, math, foreign languages. It was a classic difficult curriculum known for its sciences in particular. So they had worked hard to achieve, to find their way into college, coming out of the Depression. And also, they were under a lot of social pressure, and that's what you can see from this photo. That the other reason that a family might send a daughter to college was to get the proverbial MRS degree, to get married, basically, to meet an eligible young man from a neighboring men's school, to make a marriage, and that way to assure her economic and social future by marrying a man who either had good social standing or good academic prospects and job prospects, or both. So what you see in these colleges is as women get to the end of the senior year, they really start to feel the pressure, and there are these symbolic rituals to kind of usher them into the marriage market. So this was the May Court at Goucher College, and as far as I can tell, a May Court is sort of a vestige of a pagan fertility ritual. The women are dressed in virginal white and symbolically ushered into the marriage market. Similarly, again, just to give you a sense of the pressure, and I've interviewed some of the women on this platform, and they describe, enormous pressure. Wellesley College, which was invoked this morning, in that 1942 yearbook that you actually saw on the screen, there was an entire page listing the women who were already engaged and the men they were engaged to marry. It was that important. And there was also a section listing the women who had left college before graduation in order to get married, who they had married and what their names were now. So that's how important it was to get that, ring on your finger, if not before you had graduated pretty soon. And Wellesley had what was called the senior class hoop roll. And the winner of the hoop roll was supposed to be the class's first bride. And so that, again, that's the kind of future that these hyper-educated, really determined and persistent women were looking at in 1941, 1942. And what I love about this photo, though, is that it shows how the world was changing. So this woman, who you can see highlighted, her name was Jacqueline Jenkins when she was at Goucher. Later on, after the conclusion of the war, she would marry her sweetheart, and her name would become Jacqueline Jenkins Nye, mother of Bill Nye, the science guy. So you get a sense of what her intellectual chops must have been at the time. And this was her good friend, Gwyneth Gminder. And those two young women had already been selected by the US Navy. They had gotten that secret summons. They had answered those questions. Do you like crossword puzzles, and are you engaged to be married? And they were training in top secret in a locked classroom at the top of Goucher Hall, taught by a naval officer and by the English professor Ola Winslow, who, by the way, was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize for her biography. First woman to win a Nobel Prize for biography. So they were being taught and ushered into this very arcane field of code breaking and learning code making, but more important, learning code breaking. And so code breaking is it was a really arcane secret field. It has existed almost since the beginning of human communication. As we've sort of talked about, humans have always, as soon as we could write and speak, we had the urge to start communicating in secret to somebody important. Julius Caesar had developed a cipher. A cipher is when you replace one letter or one digit with another letter or digit. He had developed a cipher in which it was a simple substitution cipher, in which you would substitute one letter with the letter that it was ahead of it, 4 letters in the alphabet. The elements of a good code or cipher is that it be simple to use for the people using it, but very difficult for somebody else to crack. And so the Caesarean cipher didn't fit that second. It would be pretty easy to crack. But over the years, over hundreds of years, particularly in Europe, with all of its diplomatic intrigue, all of its wars, pretty sophisticated ciphers had been developed. During the Renaissance, there were sort of armchair philosophers who liked to try to develop unbreakable ciphers, often substitution ciphers using tables in which you would have certain keys that would tell you how to substitute one letter for another. So one of the first things the women did in their top secret training was they learned to do what we would call frequency analysis. They learned that letters in the alphabet have behavior patterns, that certain letters appear more frequently than others, A and S and T and words like that. They learned that certain letters travel together. S and T often travel together. Certain vowels travel together. Certain letters almost never appear together. And so if they were looking at a substitution cipher and the letter Z appeared really frequently, then they could guess that that might be an S or a T if it was a very simple substitution cipher. So they were being trained very quickly, top secret, to learn how to break codes and ciphers. And they couldn't tell anybody in their families, they couldn't tell their roommates, they couldn't tell their friends, they couldn't tell their boyfriends that they were learning, that they were about to have a completely different life and a completely different future than the one that they had been prepared for. Because of what we would call today a disruptor. Because World War II, a few months before their graduation in 1942, we had been, just as was laid out today in the presentation, on December 7th, we are surprised at Pearl Harbor. Our Pacific Fleet is anchored in Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attack on the morning of December 7th. We don't see it coming. We lose 2,000 servicemen in the space of a single morning. And it's the event that launches us into World War II, which has been going on in Europe now for a couple of years. The Nazis have taken over most of Europe at this point. We're very aware of what's going on, but we've been holding off. Japan invades us. We declare war on Japan the next day. Germany declares war on us because they're Japan's allies. And just as Adam laid out this morning, it's really unimaginable, I think, to us in this day and time to envision every young man is shipping out. Really, in a matter of days, men are signing up. Japan attacked us at Pearl Harbor with the hope that it would drive us to our knees and that we would cede them all of this territory in the Pacific that they had conquered, at the same time attacking Guam, attacking Wake Island, eventually attacking the Philippines, at the same time as Pearl Harbor. They wanted us to just cede the Pacific. And instead, the American public rose up. They said, we're not going to take this. And so all of the men wanted to sign up to fight. So all of a sudden, men are shipping out on aircraft carriers in the Pacific, convoys crossing the Atlantic Ocean over to Europe, at exactly the moment when we suddenly realize that we don't have any intelligence capabilities. As Adam said this morning, we didn't have a CIA, we didn't have an NSA, we had very little military intelligence, we didn't have a director of national intelligence. In Washington, where I live, we have 17 intelligence agencies now, some of which exist to oversee other intelligence agencies. And we didn't have any of that back then, and all of a sudden we're sending our young men into harm's way. The fate of the free world is at stake. The fascist menace seems everywhere. We don't know that we're going to win World War II. And so the US military has to do what we call now scale up overnight in terms of its intelligence gathering capabilities to make sure that these young men aren't terribly surprised the way that we just were at Pearl Harbor. So we need to build our intelligence service. And we'll start recruiting spies. We'll start recruiting spies, turning people in Europe. But it takes time to build a spy network. And what we could do much more quickly is ramp up our signals gathering intelligence overnight, learn how to snatch those signals out of the air and decipher. I'm so glad that you saw all those visuals this morning to give you a sense of how many code and cipher systems were in play in 1942. You think of how many messages you send through so many different formats every day, right? Texts, tweets, emails, Facebook updates, Instagram updates. Like, there's a constant stream of messages going out from each individual, perhaps right now as I speak, which is fine. But you think about during wartime, politicians, generals, military commanders, everybody has to communicate in a war that's global and strung out. So if you've seen The Imitation Game, you know about the Enigma cipher, this machine that the Germans were using to transform the letters of a German message, to scramble them so they would be unbreakable. And Admiral Donitz, which commanded the U-boat fleet, the German submarines, they were all through the Atlantic waiting to get our convoys. He communicated with each of those U-boats individually. He micromanaged their movements, each one. And that's just one military commander communicating with all these boats. So of course you want to get those communications. And that's just one system, one country, one group of submarines, not to mention the German army, et cetera, which is using the Enigma, but in a slightly different way. And in some cases, a slightly different Enigma machine. So there are all of these different systems. We have to put up more intercept stations bring them back to Washington, and sometimes in the field as well, and try to figure out what the enemy is saying so we don't suffer another Pearl Harbor, and so we can begin to plan offensive maneuvers as well. So this is happening at the exact moment, as Adam said, when the men who would normally do this work are suddenly unavailable because they're fighting. So before the war, the US Navy had a very small code-breaking bureau paying attention mostly to Japan. It was not a prestigious job in the US Navy, but they had to have a small bureau trying to figure out how the Japanese enciphered their communications because they knew that something might happen eventually in the Pacific between our countries. So they would recruit a very small number of men from schools like Harvard and MIT by having relationships with math and astronomy professors who would tap young men who seemed likely prospects. So the US Navy had been generating monthly memos even before the war showing where they were getting their potential code breakers and what kind of work they were being trained to do. So you can just see on this routine memo where they were getting officers, what sorts of things they were learning. And what you can see in the winter of 1941, I found this memo in the National Archives, is the light bulb moment going on over somebody's head. Where are we going to get our code breakers? New source, women's colleges. So let's see what these educated young women who have been so persistent and so resilient and so determined to educate themselves, let's give them a chance to do something other than teach school and prove what they can do for our country. And so that's when the women begin to get called in and trained very rapidly to do this kind of work. And so just to give you sort of the layout, the division of labor in World War II, again, if you've seen The Imitation Game, you know that the British, Alan Turing, had broken the German Enigma cipher, although the Germans would become suspicious and they would change the design of the Enigma machine. It had a set of rotors that, and other sorts of plugs that would scramble the letters of a message. The Germans added a rotor to their machine so that it became unbreakable again for a long period of time in 1942 when there was an enormous loss of ships in the Atlantic as a result of that. But the British had cracked the system. They understood how it worked. They had to get back in. So they were going to be the senior code-breaking partner in the Atlantic Ocean, although we would be a junior partner because we were very motivated to protect our servicemen going overseas. So that's the division of labor. But in the Pacific, we have code-breaking responsibility for an even vaster body of water. The Japanese Navy is using the Naval Fleet Code for the most part to communicate between ships and commanders, but the Japanese Army has a completely different system, and Japan is now spread out on all of these islands and peninsulas around the Pacific. They've taken the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, a lot of China, and they have to communicate regularly using a different system. So our US Army is tasked with that, with sort of its reciprocal military service. So US Navy's breaking Japanese Navy, US Army's breaking Japanese Army. And so the US Army and Navy start competing for women. It's this terrible, wonderful moment when for the first time women are competed for by the workforce. And meanwhile, private defense companies like Armstrong Cork and all of the companies, you know, making, they need people who can design blueprints. The private sector is suddenly recruiting as well at women's colleges like Wellesley, trying to get women. So there's this huge competition for women in a way that there's never been. So the US Army has to figure out, well, where are we going to get our code breakers if the Navy has beaten us to Wellesley and Smith and Radcliffe, the so-called Seven Sisters schools, as well as schools like Goucher. So the Army decides to go after school teachers, because this is the other educated workforce that they can tap from. So these women are going to do what we call pivot, right? They're going to learn how to do a completely different occupation, although I found memos in which the Army said, God, school teachers make the greatest workers. They're underpaid, they're overworked. They're single because they have to be, because there was something called a marriage bar back then. You were expected to quit work when you got married. And so these women were just like the ideal worker. They didn't have any family encumbrances. They were used to being underpaid and overworked. And so the Army sent forth recruiting officers throughout the South and the Midwest to recruit the women in public, so they couldn't tell them even what they were being recruited to do. And the recruiting strategy that they chose, and I found this in oral histories in the National Archives, is they decided to send their handsomest young Army officers out to recruit these women, under the thinking that, that Southern women in particular were susceptible to the charms of a handsome man in uniform, and that the women would come to Washington to get married because they thought that they would be able to marry a man who looked like, and this is true. I mean, I found this in oral histories, the commanders congratulating themselves about this strategy. And this woman is a central character in my book, Dot Braden. And what I love about Dot is that she shows how wrong-headed the recruitment strategy was, even as it worked. So Dot was trying to get out of a marriage that she didn't want to enter into. Her college boyfriend was pressuring her from his training camp in California to marry him. He had sent her a ring, and the women were told, don't upset the morale of the troops. So she was afraid to send the ring back. She liked this guy, but she didn't want to marry him and spend the rest of her life with him, and she was looking for an out. She was looking for an excuse not to have to follow him to his training camp. So she was recruited for exactly the opposite reason, to get out of an entanglement that she found herself in, that she was looking for a way out. She was also the oldest daughter in a family of 4. She was supporting her single mother on her school teacher salary, which was $900 a year. She was helping to support her mother's household. Both of her younger brothers were in the Army now, overnight. And like so many American women, she wanted to serve as well. She wanted to do what she could to bring her brothers home. And so she walked through the front door of the Virginia Hotel in her hometown of Lynchburg. She was recruited by one of those officers. She didn't care whether he was handsome. She knew that this was government work. It would be serving the war. It would pay almost twice as much as what she made teaching school. It would pay $1,700 a year, which was a lot of money for her. And it would bring her to Washington, D.C. It would bring her to the city that was becoming the beating heart of the free world. Washington was 3 hours from her hometown of Lynchburg. She had never been there. She grew up during the Depression. Her mom didn't even have a car. So she took the train to Washington, D.C. She alighted in Union Station, where for the first time the arrival of trains was being announced by women's voices, because again, the men were off fighting. She took a cab to a place called Arlington Hall, that before the war it had been what was called a junior college for women. And again, this was back in the day when you didn't want to give women too much education. And so a junior college was a place where young women would board. They would get like their last 2 years of high school, as well as sort of a first 2 years of some college courses, things like French, English, typing, horseback riding, deportment, the kind of skills and that was thought would prepare them again for their life course of getting married. And so this is interesting also. The U.S. intelligence agencies didn't have secure facilities at this point in the war. Now, these days, if you're in Maryland or you're in Virginia, the CIA needs a secure facility, or NSA does. There are all sorts of conference areas that can provide secure facilities. But these were top secret code-breaking operations. You didn't want the enemy to know. There wasn't any kind of real estate like that. So the Army took over Arlington Hall. It kicked the girls out. It sent the horses away. It paved the riding ring to become storage areas. And it built these enormous temporary buildings in which this data management workforce would materialize and begin to build a data culture. And I wasn't thinking in those terms when I was doing my research, but that is absolutely what they were doing. So you can see these former school teachers pivoting in terms of their training and their abilities and their mission. And in this photo, they're learning the geography of Asia. They're learning words for countries and locations that they're going to need in the messages. You know, they might have heard of some of these places, but there were a lot of places that they never would have heard of. And they're learning to use machines, early machines. These women are receiving teletype from the Pacific. And now you can see the vast, vast rooms of women using pencil and paper and their brains to do what we would call, or what would now be done by computers. And the Pencil Pushing Mamas Sank the Shipping of Japan was actually a line from a poem that one of them wrote. This was a very literate workforce. They occasionally had downtime. And so in my research, I found a lot of poems and various sort of literary creations. So they actually had one that was in homage to a song of the time called Pistol Packin' Mama. but it was in the cadence of the Raven, so pencil push and mama sank the shipping of Japan. And what they were actually doing was sinking ships. So the Japanese army was spread out on all of these islands around the Pacific, and it had to be supplied by water, by ship, for everything: rice, water, medicine, food, fuel. Everything was brought by ship to the islands, to the Japanese army, and those ships had to communicate by radio to say where they were coming from, where they were headed, where they would be at noon on a certain day, and what they were carrying. And the Japanese army, like the Navy, was communicating in what they called a super enciphered code system. So a code system is where a word like maru for commercial ship is replaced by another word or group of numbers. So that's a code, is when a code could be like if I say dress should really be pants, right? You can, any sort of word could be substituted for another. And then a cipher is when each word or digit is replaced by another one. It's sort of like a subunit. So the Japanese were doing both. So a word like maru would be, which was the word for supply ship, would be replaced by four numbers. And then they would encipher those numbers by adding 4 more numbers to it using something called non-carrying addition that you might be familiar with, where you don't carry the 1. So 6 plus 7 becomes 3 instead of 13. And so it would become 4 completely different digits. And what the school teachers had to learn how to do was receive this jumble of letters, and they had to figure out what was called the additive was the number. They had to subtract out the additive, reversing the non-carrying addition. So it was a non-carrying subtraction in order to get down to the code and figure out, so-and-so ship is carrying so-and-so rice, and it'll be here at noon on the next day. And so there's a lot of, and the Japanese are changing their code books regularly. So the number that stood for maru one month might be different the next month. So they're constantly having to break back into the system. So even as someone has, the breaking of that code system in April 1943 was a massive collective effort between about 5 women and 5 men who shut themselves up in a room and worked overnight because somebody had noticed one pattern in one message, and they worked together and they figured out how that super enciphered system worked, and how the Japanese were embedding in their messages what was called an indicator that would tell the receiving army official what code book and what page of the additive book had been used, and that was embedded in each message, and then it was enciphered, and so this team had figured that out. So that's one way to break a system, but then the school teachers had to break the messages every day, so they had to do that reverse engineering work. So that illustrates, as Adam said, you had one team of people doing sort of work at one level, and then you had other people doing work at a different level, but it's all vital, and it's all urgent, and it's all hard. And that's what the school teachers were doing. They were working together, did I just go backwards? They were working together, with each other on what was an assembly line. And in fact, the code-breaking operations were explicitly modeled on the American assembly line. So just as we're starting to turn out bombers and Liberty ships using our assembly line technology to build the armaments of war, and the vessels will need to carry them, they're using those same techniques to break the code system. So they'll teach a woman like Dot, my school teacher, how to do a certain portion of the message. She'll run to get it to, this was called the overlapping station, and these women would push the message further along. They had to work really fast so that the message would be broken, radio to an American submarine commander who would be waiting on the horizon when the ship appeared, and as a result, thousands and thousands of Japanese supply ships were sunk in what was one of the 3 most important code-breaking efforts of World War II. The breaking of the German Enigma cipher was one, the code-breaking of the Battle of Midway was the other, but the relentless sinking of Japanese shipping was the other 3rd great code-breaking Allied triumph of World War II. And I interviewed Dot over and over for this book, and when I would try to impress upon her how important her work was, it was very difficult for her to even absorb it. And when she finally sort of absorbed the enormousness of what she had done, it really changed her view of herself. I mean, she had a different understanding at 92 of who she was and what she had accomplished, and so it was a very moving experience to have. This is a photo that you saw. You see the blonde-headed woman laughing down at her work, sitting next to the dead plant. That was this young woman named Ann Cara Christie, who came from Russell Sage College in New York as an English major. And she and a West Virginia school teacher broke a different system. Again, to give you a sense of the complexity, these Japanese Army messages would be sent through the airwaves using radio and Morse code, which was the typical communication pattern. You know, we didn't have not so much phones, certainly not email. Very, very public way to send messages, right? So that's why they're enciphered and encrypted. But at the beginning of every message would be an address, who was sending it, where it was coming from, who it was going to, where they were located, and that was enciphered a different way. And so Ann Cara Christie and a West Virginia school teacher named Wilma Berryman broke that system, and as a result of that breakthrough, the Pentagon was able to build every day what was called order of battle, which was a very important intelligence report, basically understanding where the Japanese army is located, whether a new base is being set up, who's communicating with whom. So even just having those addresses, like you remember letters, right? You remember envelopes. And so, but you know, it's just like that, the name, the address, who's sending it, where they're located, and that seems like nothing, but that was very, very vital information, intelligence to have. And so the Pentagon would be breathing down their neck every day to get that intelligence report, to get the information out. And again, the idea of trusted data. Signals intelligence is very trusted data. It's real-time communication that the enemy is sending. This is the group of women who were every day breaking that system called Purple that Adam mentioned. So this was a machine cipher that Japanese diplomats were using all over the world in Japanese embassies, and there were a lot of Japanese diplomats in Europe, in Germany, in Italy, communicating with Hitler, communicating with Mussolini and all the fascist leaders, and sending long diplomatic correspondence back to Tokyo. We snatched every one of those messages out of the air, and thanks to Genevieve Grochin and her ability to recognize patterns, this was a machine that what the Japanese diplomats, the message would be actually rendered in what's called Romanji, which is Romanized Japanese. So it would be spelled out in Roman letters, in syllables, and the machine would transform each of those into a different word or a different syllable. And she looked at these reams of messages and spotted the pattern that enabled the American codebreakers to reconstruct a machine that they had never seen before based on the patterns that she saw. Also helped by a very insecure practice. And this, again, I think is relevant to all of us because it gives you a sense of how the communications devices that exist during the day sort of control how we communicate. The Japanese were constrained by the rules of Morse code, by international Morse code. Was at a certain point, it was cheaper to send a message if the 5 letters in these groups were pronounceable. So they needed to have 2 vowels in them. And so the Japanese machine had one wheel that converted vowels into vowels to make sure that vowels would stay vowels and consonants into consonants. So they called one wheel the 6s and one wheel the 20s. And so as they were looking at these patterns, they had broken the 20s. They had figured out how that part of the machine worked, but it was the 6s that was holding them up. And so Genevieve Grochin spotted the pattern that enabled them to break the 6s. So I just think it's so interesting. The Japanese government was trying to save money by designing this machine. It wanted to send cheaper telegrams. And so as a result of that, it designed this machine. By the time the Purple machine came along, they didn't actually, this was no longer the case. They didn't need to do the vowels and the consonants. The international rules had changed. But the codebreakers knew that often elements of an old machine would be used in the new, like some design from the old machine would be used in the new one. So they were also understanding how technology is developed. And then they were conjecturing. There's a huge amount of conjecturing involved in code breaking. So as a result of that, we were able to read all of these diplomatic communications. So when we were planning the D-Day invasion, the liberation of France, the liberation of Europe, and the defeat of the Germans, we want to know where to land on the coast of France. The Japanese diplomats have been invited by Hitler, who's very proud, to tour the fortifications on the coast of France. And they've reported back to Tokyo that Normandy is slightly less fortified than Calais. And so that is part of the way in which we decided to land in Normandy. So that's the kind of intelligence that we're getting from these women, from these rooms full of women who were doing who are doing this very difficult work and essentially hacking. That's what this says. It's hacking. The enemy is trying to do cybersecurity. We're hacking their cybersecurity. And so it's interesting to know that the U.S. Army was segregated during World War II, but there was a code-breaking unit that was breaking the codes and ciphers of the private sector. So the equivalent of banks and companies like Amazon, all of whom are encrypting their correspondence even back in 1942. This African-American unit is assigned to make sure that nobody's doing business with Hitler, nobody's doing business with companies like Mitsubishi. And so that was very important work as well. And on the topic of cybersecurity, I love this, and I think this ties in with some of the charts that we saw very recently in the keynote. We were also planning deception operations. So before the invasion of Normandy, we wanted the Germans to think that we were going to invade in Calais, because they were braced for an Allied landing somewhere, sometime. And so what a group of women were assigned to do is study our radio traffic and our radio frequencies, our communications that we're sending, in order to create what we might call today fake news, in order to create dummy traffic, fake signals that would exactly duplicate and be totally plausible to the Germans to persuade them that a huge Allied force was in a different part of England poised to invade Calais. It was called the First Army. It had a name, the First U.S. Army Group. It was supposedly commanded, I think, by Patton, and it didn't exist. It didn't exist at all. It was a total fake. It was non-existent. But they created the facsimile, the communications facsimile, and it worked. And it had to work long enough so that the Germans would keep their troops in Calais. Even after the D-Day landings happen, they're going to be coming onto the beaches. Their days, D-Day is days and days and days, and we need the Germans to stay in Calais to think that another landing's about to happen, and that all happened as a result of this dummy traffic. So meanwhile, the girls that you saw, the young women that you saw in their frilly dresses graduating from Goucher, are being ushered into the U.S. Navy. So the World War II is a big tipping point for women in the military. The Army school teachers remain civilians. The Army likes to have its code-breaking force civilian, which is interesting because it creates a very flat organizational structure. Anybody can be promoted. The 23-year-old Ann Cara Christie can end up heading the whole address unit. So they're an advantage to a civilian workforce. But the Navy wants its women in uniform. It wants them subjected to military hierarchy and discipline. So these women are invited to join the U.S. Navy, and that was a big deal. And there was a lot of talk about leadership, about women having the opportunity to prove themselves as leaders. And there was also a big coming together for women. Again, you talk about building a data culture. And because the waves were created, women came from all parts of the country. Even if women didn't have a college education, if they wanted to enlist in the waves, as in become an enlisted woman, as opposed to an officer, college graduates became officers, but enlisted women, high school graduates became enlisted women. If they tested high for aptitude, they would be routed into the naval code-breaking operation, even without that training or without a college degree. So there was this great coming together of women from the northeastern seaboard, from California, from Colorado, getting on troop trains, coming together. One of my favorite anecdotes in the book is a woman who came from a very elite family on the Upper East Side of New York. She signed up against her parents' wishes to enlist in the U.S. Navy. She was very nearsighted, so she had to memorize the eye chart in advance and slip her spectacles in her pocket so she would pass the eye exam. And then she got to the group physical, which she had not anticipated. And the women, like the men, were asked to take their clothes off. And so what she remembered when I interviewed was that she had gone to this very fancy high school where she had never seen another young woman without her clothes off. She had never heard the word breast. And this petty officer came up and drew the number 9 in between her breasts and said, all right, go stand between 8 and 10, because they all had to stand there for their group physical. And so she remembers, because she was so nearsighted, that she had to actually really go up and peer closely at all of the women before she knew where to stand. And that was her welcome to the U.S. Navy. But she also didn't go in as an officer. She had gone to music school in Boston instead of college. She thought she'd be an officer, but she had to be an enlisted woman, which she absolutely loved. Her first bunkmate, was a woman from the Midwest whose father was an undertaker, and he gave his daughter a music box in the shape of a casket for Christmas, And Jane just remembered that was her introduction to decorating schemes that she had never encountered on the Upper East Side. But it was just the most important experience of her life. She came into her own. She discovered her math abilities that her family had never acknowledged. They had always told her she was bad at math. In fact, she was really good at math. And she discovered that for the first time. And the camaraderie and the patriotism and the coming together and the building of this data culture working. They were literally using conveyor belts, as you can see, to push the messages along, using these early assembly line technologies, working, and as Adam said, these stacks of Japanese messages. And they know that we're pushing back now across the Pacific. The Battle of Midway is a turning point, but after the Battle of Midway, we have to try to retake all this territory, all these terrible amphibious landings on Okinawa, on Guam, Iwo Jima. These are bloody, terrible battles. Their brothers and their boyfriends are out there on aircraft carriers. They're working as fast as they can to recover additives, to break the Japanese naval fleet codes. They know that the lives of men are at stake, even as they're doing work that is hard, it's slow, sometimes it's boring, but it's also really important. They will get memos saying, something's about to happen, something big is about to happen in the Pacific. We need you women to recover more additives, to subtract out. They're building the Japanese additive books. They will subtract out, figure out what the additives are and try to actually rebuild the additive books. And they had to do it faster and faster and faster. And I would see memos congratulating them for not only making their quotas, but exceeding their quotas. And you saw this morning. This is one of the worksheets showing the work that they're doing with their brains, with pen and paper. I think what we see is that the top line is the code group that would be received when it's snatched out of the Japanese signal. And I think what you're seeing in pencil below is the number after the additive had been subtracted, because they knew they had gotten down to a valid code group if it was divisible by 3. And they very quickly learned that you can tell if a 5-digit number, because the Japanese Navy was using 5 digits, you can tell if it's divisible by 3. You strike the 3s, you strike the 6s, you strike the 9s, and if the digits that are left add up to a number that is divisible by 3, the whole number is divisible by 3. And I interviewed these women like 75 years later, and they still remembered that. They still remembered that that's how they did their work. And so they had to work with other kinds of systems as well. You saw this image this morning. The Japanese would communicate, the Navy would communicate using its big naval fleet code between ships, but if it was just a couple ships communicating with each other or between islands, they would do what we would consider like texting. We'll send an email if it's big and important and long, but if it's a quick, short message, we'll text. So they set up a completely different system for their short, local messages that was enciphered using a table and Japanese syllables, and there was a different group of women who were working that system. They had a key that changed every month that governed the table, and the hard part was breaking back into the key. And so they remembered they would have big parties. This was Washington, D.C. If they were officers, they were living unchaperoned. So there was a lot of alcohol in Washington during the war. They would have big parties 2 weeks before the key would change. They could recover from their hangovers by the time they had to do the really hard brain work of getting back into the key system. And in April of 1943, they received a set of messages that Admiral Yamamoto, the commander of the Japanese Navy, mastermind at Pearl Harbor, was going to be making an inspection tour of the Solomon Islands. Some of the messages came down in the Naval Fleet Code. Some of them came down, though, in the Inter-Island Cipher. And so the teams, again, teams having to work together, worked together. People work in the Fleet Code, people work in the Inter-Island Cipher, mostly women from Wellesley, actually, to put together his itinerary down to the nanosecond so that we were able to shoot his plane out of the air. And the decision was made to assassinate an enemy commander. And the women remembered that cheering went up in the Codebreaking compound in Washington, D.C. when they knew that the Admiral's plane, top secret military operation, but they knew. And, it's worth pointing out that they found enormous satisfaction when they knew that they had led to the sinking of a convoy or downed an enemy plane, because it was wartime and they wanted to bring their brothers and boyfriends home and they wanted to win the war. And later on in their life, there was no counseling after this, there was no acknowledgement of PTSD, but later on in their lives, they would come to they were very proud of the work that they did, but they would come to really appreciate what was at stake. And It's also worth pointing out to this crowd that we ultimately took over Atlantic codebreaking from the British. When the Germans changed the design of their machines, we needed big machines that could work the four-rotor German Enigma machine that was scrambling the German messages. And so we built giant machines called BOMB, B-O-M-B-E, that were run by women. And women had to design essentially what were early computer menus. They would get the scrambled message. They would conjecture what these scrambled letters probably stood for. Like if it was a weather message, the word wetter might appear in it, the German word weather. If it was in the Bay of Biscay, the word Biscaya might appear in it. And so they would guess, and then they would look at the scrambled messages, what it probably said, and they would figure out the permutations that the German Enigma machine might have to go through in order to make those changes. And they would design a menu, they would plug it into the bomb machine, they would run it, and the bomb machine would confirm whether or not it was a plausible menu. And then they had a facsimile of the Enigma, they would plug it in, and if it came out in German, then they would know that they had broken the messages. And again, those keys changed every day as well. So as a result of our successful code breaking, the Atlantic Ocean was cleared of the U-boats. We were able to send massive convoys, thousands of ships across the Atlantic to provide the men and the material to mount the D-Day invasions. And the women running the machines in Washington experienced the D-Day landings from the point of view of the German message traffic as the Germans were reacting to what was happening. So that was an extraordinary life experience for them. So in the midst, just again to show you that there's nothing new under the sun, all of the things that we struggle with, the feeling of being overwhelmed, sort of finding the signal in the noise, learning, what data we can trust, all of these things that we have to struggle with every day, the women were doing, and using what we would today call resilience and grit. At the same time, they were living private lives. They were writing soldiers. Again, the communication at the time for the men overseas was letters. And so they were writing ceaseless letters to the men in their lives. My central character, Dot, you'll be glad to know she disentangled herself from the unwanted fiance. She was writing 5 men simultaneously. Their lives in Washington were a lot like the life of somebody on a dating app, really, because there were men cycling in and out Washington, D.C. all the time. There were men overseas, so they were writing a lot of different guys at the same time. She was actually more reluctant to have that fact go into the book than the fact of her code breaking because she thought it would make her look bad. But in fact, it was very, very common. Some women were writing as many as a dozen men at the same time. And they were sending they were sending selfies, really. I mean, they were probably sexting in some way. But this was Dot on the beach writing the airman who she would ultimately marry. And they had these little Kodak cameras. Obviously, they weren't selfies because they weren't taking them of themselves, but they were these little photographs that would be enclosed in every letter. And she gave me about 12 of them because she and her ultimate husband became engaged through correspondence. They wrote each other all during the war. So again, the need to communicate urgently as they're building their relationship. He's over in Africa and Europe, and she's sending him these photos. So I just thought it was wonderful. They were finding ways to remind each other of what they looked like. And you can see her flirtatious expression. I really love that. She's in the foreground. And so after the war, most of the women were sent home. 10,000 women, shortened the war. Codebreaking shortened World War II by at least a year and a half, saved thousands of lives, probably forestalled our invading Japan, saved lives on all sides in all countries because the war was shortened. So it didn't just save Allied lives, it saved Axis lives as well. These women were all enlisted women working together, camaraderie, data culture, friendship, kicked out after the war. Thanks, ladies. You promised you'd go home after the war, so go home, have babies, let's have the baby boom. So they did, but they really missed each other. They missed the camaraderie, they missed the importance of the work. And so for the rest of their lives, they wrote something that I'd never heard of called a round robin letter, where one woman writes a letter showing, has that shown up yet? Yeah, showing, talking about her day and what she's doing, and then she sends it to the next woman who writes her own letter, who sends both letters to the third woman who writes her own, that goes to the fourth, it goes all around the circle. The first letter comes out, the original woman puts a new letter in, and that it's called a round robin letter, early kind of Facebook, here's what I'm doing today. And that round robin letter kept going through the 1950s, the 1960s, 70s, 80s, new millennium, election of Barack Obama. And by the time I was doing my reporting, there were 2 women left, and they were writing each other every day. And so that is how important their work was to them, even as they couldn't talk about it. They had been told at the very beginning, you'll be shot if you tell anybody what. Don't think that just because you're a woman, you won't be shot, because it's treason to reveal intelligence work. So they kept that secret, and they did not talk to each other about their work, but they talked about their lives, and they kept each other, you know, through hard times, through the Vietnam War, through their own children going to war. They kept that friendship group. And when I was doing my reporting, there was the woman in the front in the striped shirt, Ruth Mirsky, was communicating with me sometimes by email, and her email address was Ruth the Wave. So that's how important her naval service and her codebreaking was to her, even as she couldn't talk about it and had never talked about it to anybody until I interviewed her. So I'm just going to quickly let you hear from 3 of the women who I interviewed. And the first is Dot, the school teacher from Lynchburg, Virginia, and you can hear her Southern accent, among other things. Talking about her train ride to Washington, her first train ride. And of course, her welcome to Washington was being told she'd be shot if she talked about the work that she did. The women were told to say that they were secretaries. And everybody believed them. They were the ideal intelligence officers because everybody assumed that whatever a woman was doing, it was boring and unimportant. And so it was very easy for them to keep the secret. And so I think I'm going to end with Dorothy Romali, who was recruited from a teacher's college in Pennsylvania. Her aspiration in life was to be a math teacher, and that was difficult for a woman before the war to get hired as a math teacher because math wasn't considered a woman's field, but she was a brilliant mathematician, and she'll explain why she was so motivated to do this very difficult work. Now let's see. Yep. So she got tears in her eyes, still remembering the vision of her male classmates being rounded up and put on a bus to Pittsburgh to go enlist in the fighting. And what I love about her is that, many things, but that she became a math teacher after the war, and she would end up teaching at the public middle school in Arlington, Virginia, that my own children would later attend. And that's how close we are. You know, that's how few degrees of separation there are between us and these women. And I love the thought of 7th and 8th graders taking Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 from Miss Romali, having no idea that this sweet, kind woman, who many people remembered as the best math teacher they ever had been a badass codebreaker during World War II. So good and so badass that she started working for the U.S. Army as a civilian, and eventually the U.S. Navy managed to lure her away with an officer's housing allowance. So she made an extra $50 a year. So she went from sinking Army ships to sinking naval battleships. And so it was really extremely moving and important for me to do these interviews, and to find so many records substantiating, again, sort of data management. I worried when I was interviewing these women, could I substantiate what they remembered? And I was amazed at the paper record, the worksheets, the memos, the rosters. I was able to find Dot's name and see when she had gotten her introduction and her training courses. Like, there was a vast paper record that substantiated everything that they remembered. And so it was quite a data management challenge for me as well, but I was so inspired by their persistence and their resilience and their grit and what it takes to get up every day in the morning saying, okay, I'm overwhelmed, but I'm gonna make sense of this, and I'm gonna render it into some sort of form that will be intelligible to readers so that I can share the story with them. And I think the two messages that I would leave you with are, genius is collective often. You know, yes, there are individual geniuses, Alan Turing, Anne Carr Christie, John Nash. There is individual genius, but genius is so often a collaborative, collective effort, 10 people shutting themselves into a room, working into the night, everybody remembering things, helping each other. And so we just forget that, you know, we sort of lionize these tortured geniuses and make movies about sort of one person, often one man, and their rise and fall. But so often it is a big cast of characters. Hidden Figures is obviously another example of that. And so it's important to remember how important collaboration is to genius, and also the importance of inclusion, diversity and inclusion, because World War II was an example of inclusion. We didn't use that word back then, but it was a moment where, because the men were all fighting, we needed to avail ourselves of all our citizens. So you've heard of the Navajo code talkers, men who were doing cybersecurity in the Pacific. You've heard of the Tuskegee Airmen, African-American men who, you know, served as pilots and proved that black men could fly planes. There were African-American women joining the Women's Army Corps, doing very important work and bringing women in as code breakers. The Allied countries did that. The US did it, England did it, Australia did it, New Zealand did it. Axis countries, Japan and Germany, what were they doing with their excluded minorities, right? I mean, the Germans were exterminating their minorities and had a very different view of women and their capabilities. And so there are many reasons why we won World War II and why we're all here today, turning out, you know, tanks, the bravery of the men in all the theaters of war. But the decision to be inclusive with your population at a time of crisis is the decision that the Allied side made. And, you know, as a result of that, we're all here today. So thank you for sitting through this. I think I've exceeded my time limit, so I think I probably shouldn't take questions because you all need to go on to your next, what? Oh. I mean, if you want to stay, I'm happy to answer one or two, but I won't be offended if you leave. I was talking to through a long sequence of events, I was talking to some historians at the NSA, the National Security Agency, is our descendant agency of this. And basically, we were talking about one thing, but they started talking about this story. And I couldn't believe that it hadn't already been told, and that was what launched me on the path of trying to tell it. They were recruiting people who could speak German and Japanese. So if you had gone to Wellesley and majored in German, you were going to be working on that German Enigma U-boat effort. So they did train people in these languages, but they were also desperate to find people who could speak. So they would recruit also young missionaries, because that was another respectable occupation for a college-educated woman. And so actually the young woman who read the Japanese surrender message before anybody else did was a young former missionary, Virginia Adderholt, who knew Japanese and had mastered this particular Japanese message system, and the message arrived in that particular system. So.
Since the Navy was enlistment mode versus the Army doing it civilian wise, how did they ensure that women didn't get overlooked for those positions and whatnot?
You know, there probably were women who got overlooked, but it was a really massive recruiting effort. And women, of course, would come to enlisting stations for the waves. That was because there were all those posters that you saw, join up, join up, join up. And there was a lot of patriotism, so the women would just present themselves. But women did get overlooked, and the Navy, there was suspicion that the Navy was also wanted attractive women. This was kind of a really important moment. They wanted its women to look good, and so there might have been women who were overlooked because they didn't meet the physical characteristics or whatever. So I'm sure it was, you know, it was a messy, and I'm sure there was leakage, you know, of talent, but it was just such a massive recruiting effort.
So you gave the example of Dorothy Romali becoming a math teacher. What happened to the majority of these other women? Did they go back
Yeah.
to the workforce?
A lot of them left the workforce, and we lost their talent and their training. And because there were government propaganda reels after the war saying, go home, go home, go home. And, but some of them, a lot of the women I interviewed, by the time their kids were in middle school, did return to the workforce in some way. Dot became a teacher and then a realtor. She had a successful realty career. One woman who wanted to become an architect, she had been a naval codebreaker, and she was shut out of architecture schools after the war because they were holding the spots open for men. Returning from the war, so she couldn't use her GI benefits for that, but she taught herself computer programming, and she became head of like the computer system at the University of Cincinnati. So some of them, you know, they were so gifted, they found their way back into the workforce. So it was a variety, but you know, unfortunately, we stopped being inclusive after the war. It was sort of a temporary thing. But, you know, like Ann Cara Christie, there was a group of women who stayed on at the NSA, and Ann Cara Christie became the first female deputy director of NSA. There were a number, she and a number of women were doing code breaking during the Cold War. They were breaking Russian, Chinese, Cuban message systems, and most of them never married, because if you married, you really were expected to go home. To stay home. And so they were single women for the 50s and 60s, really devoting themselves to public service.
We know if members of the Axis ever figured out that the code breakers were women on our side, and if so, were they ever in danger? Like,
you know, the women would be told that they might be in danger, that they could be kidnapped or something, and so they would have like, they would go out for drinks in Washington. They would have code words. If somebody ordered a vodka Collins, that was a sign that they thought somebody was listening in on their conversation, and they would all disperse. So they were given the impression that they might be not necessarily kidnapped or in harm's way, but that there might be spies, you know, listening in on them. There really, I don't think, weren't that many. Japan didn't have many spies in this country. The Russians did. So I don't know whether the Germans or Japanese ever figured out that we had women code breakers, but they were always on alert. They were very stressed out by their top secret security clearances. They were always afraid they would bring some scrap of paper home. So they sort of lived in fear that they would say the wrong things or even talk in their sleep. They worried about talking in their sleep.
do we know who was the first person to recommend that they recruit from women's colleges?
That's the first person, no, but there was a bit of a tradition even before the war, like Genevieve Grochin, who broke purple. That was in 1940, before the war. So there were some women on these the Army and the Navy both had very small code-breaking bureaus before the war, and in some cases they had already hired women because it was not a prestigious career path in the U.S. military, either Navy or Army. So like, yeah, we'll bring in some women civilians, because the government in the 1940s, compared to the private sector, was a little bit more willing to hire women. So they might take the civil service exam. That's what Genevieve Grochin did. She wanted to teach a college level math. No university would hire a female math teacher, so she took the civil service exam. She was a statistician. She came down and worked for a retirement board, calculating like the Railroad Retirement Agency, calculating pensions and annuities and stuff. And then she took a math test for a promotion, just to get a promotion, a raise in salary. And William Friedman, who was married to a female codebreaker, saw her math score. And he recruited her into the Army Codebreaking Bureau, which was then working the Purple Machine. So he was very willing to hire women, and he was married to a very smart woman. And so but the combination that it wasn't a prestigious field, so a lot of men didn't want it, And the fact that the US government was one place that was slightly more willing to hire women was a way in which women got routed into it, sort of quietly. So I'll take one more question and then. Two. I'm sorry, who? What?
About the lost potential.
I do. Yeah, the women did. Yeah.
Did they feel that way?
Yeah, they did. And they, I mean, men did too. You know, there were a lot of men, like older college professor type men who were recruited to work on the Codebreaking compound. And a lot of them felt like this was the best work I ever did. You know, I was born to do this work. So, but the women, many of the women felt as though these were the glory days for them. Just to show you what they had to put up with, Dot, her brothers both survived the war, and they both had jobs after the war that entailed having top secret security clearances. So they would get together, her brothers, and brag about their security clearances, and she could never tell them that she had had a top secret security clearance too. So it was frustrating for them.
So I'm assuming that our codes were getting broken by the Axis. Did we ever leverage our code breakers to make our code more difficult?
Yeah, we had a whole cybersecurity team, and most of the like William Friedman, who I just talked about, was a code maker. So most code breakers would start by making codes. I mean, you'll love them. They had to randomize. If you're making a code, you want to have certain words, but then you want there to be an element of randomness. So they would throw index cards into the fan. That was the randomized way you would randomize back then, and then pick them up, and then they would become the. We were making our codes as well, and we had our own machine like the Enigma that would encipher our messages. It was called the Sagaba, and it was never broken. So that's why you didn't hear about it. The reason you hear about the Enigma is because it was broken, and we have these movies and things like that. The Sagaba is not as glorious and sexy because it really worked. Thank you so much.